Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you squirm a little in your bed. The deliberate, ritualistic self-torture that medieval monks inflicted upon themselves in the name of spiri. You've probably seen it in movies, those hooded figures whipping themselves with chains and leather straps until blood ran down their backs like crimson rivers. Hollywood loves the dramatic spectacle, the gothic horror of it all. But the real story? It's far more complex, disturbing, and strangely human than any film could capture. You might think these monks were simply religious fanatics who'd lost their minds in the isolation of monastery walls. The truth is both simpler and more profound. These were educated men, often the most intelligent people of their time, who believed they were following the most logical path to salvation their world could offer. They weren't crazy. They were products of a civilization that understood pain, suffering, and the human body in ways that would seem alien to us today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those brave enough to dive into the darker corners of medieval spirituality with me tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. You're about to enter a world where the line between devotion and self-destruction blurred until it disappeared entirely, where men sought God through the systematic destruction of their own flesh. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the minds and hearts of people who believed that bleeding was the price of heaven. The weight of medieval sin, you wake up in the year 1348, and you're not you anymore. You're Brother Thomas, a 32-year-old Benedictine monk in the monastery of St. Denis, just outside Paris. The bells are ringing for lauds, the first prayer service of the day, and your back is already throbbing. Not from sleeping on the hard wooden plank that serves as your bed, though that doesn't help. No, your back throbs because 3 hours ago, in the cold darkness before dawn, you took a leather scourge studded with iron fragments and methodically struck yourself 47 times. You counted each blow, as you always do. 47 sins you committed yesterday in thought, word, and deed. 47 strikes to balance the cosmic scales. You swing your legs over the side of your narrow cot, and immediately you feel the pull of dried blood cracking against the rough wool of your habit. The fabric has stuck to the wounds again, and when you move, it's like someone is playing a violin with a bow made of broken glass across your shoulder blades. But this is good. This is necessary. This is the path. See, you live in a world where sin isn't just a spiritual concept. It's a physical reality with mathematical precision. Every impure thought about Brother Benedict's smooth hands during Vespers, every moment of pride when the abbot praised your illuminated manuscript, every fleeting instant of anger when Brother Marcus ate the last of the decent bread. Each of these infractions creates an actual debt in the celestial ledger, and debts must be paid. Your education at the cathedral school taught you that God is perfect justice incarnate. Justice demands balance. If you sin, something must be given in return. The church offers indulgences, true, but those cost money your monastery doesn't have. Prayer helps, but prayers are just words, and words feel insufficient against the weight of your failures. But pain is real. Pain is currency. Pain is the one thing you can offer that has the same substance as the damage your sins have caused to your soul. You stand slowly, feeling every movement ripple across the network of scabs and fresh wounds that have become as familiar to you as the calluses on your knees from hours of prayer. The other brothers are stirring now, 37 men in identical brown robes, each carrying their own secret geography of self-inflicted suffering. Brother Marcus limps slightly from the iron chain he wraps around his thigh. Brother Francis moves his arms stiffly because he wears a hair shirt lined with thorns under his habit. Brother David hasn't spoken above a whisper in 3 months because he burned his tongue with a heated coin to mortify his tendency toward gossip. You file out of the dormitory with the others, bare feet slapping against stone floors that are perpetually cold, perpetually damp. The monastery smells like incense, old parchment, boiled barley, and something else, something metallic and organic that clings to the walls and seeps into the very mortar. It's the smell of centuries of blood, sweat, and tears offered up as spiritual sacrifice. It's the smell of holiness, distilled into its most elemental form. As you walk through the cloisters toward the chapel, you pass the room where the scourges are kept. Each brother has his own, crafted specifically for his particular sins and spiritual needs. Yours is made of 7 leather strips, each about 18 inches long, with small iron beads sewn into the tips. Brother Marcus prefers chains. Brother Francis uses knotted ropes soaked in salt water. The newest novice, Brother Paul, started with simple hemp cord, though you suspect he'll graduate to something more severe soon enough. They always do. The morning light is just beginning to filter through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stone corridors. But even in the growing daylight, you can see the dark stains on the walls at shoulder height where generations of monks have practiced their devotions. Some of those stains are decades old, permanent reminders of the spiritual battles fought and won in these hallowed halls. You enter the chapel and take your place in the choir stalls, the worn wood smooth under your hands from centuries of devout grip. As you begin to chant the psalms, your voice joining with the others in the familiar Latin words, you feel the wounds on your back begin to warm and soften. By the time the service ends, some of them will have started bleeding again, and you'll need to apply fresh herbs to prevent infection. Brother Matthias died of fever last winter after his wounds turned putrid, but that was a risk you all accepted. Better to die in pursuit of holiness than to live in comfortable sin. The abbot begins the reading from Scripture, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. You know these words by heart, have meditated on them for years, but this morning they seem to burn themselves into your consciousness with new intensity. Take up your cross daily. Daily. Every single day. The choice between comfort and salvation. Every single day. The opportunity to prove your devotion not with words, but with blood. As the service continues, you find your mind wandering to the leather scourge waiting in your cell. Tonight, after Compline, you'll return to your room and examine your conscience by candlelight. You'll count your sins carefully, methodically, the way Brother Benedict taught you in your first year here. Pride, 3 instances. Anger, 5. Lust, 2. Maybe 3, if you count that moment when you noticed how the morning light made Sister Catherine's face glow when she brought bread from the convent next door. Gluttony, definitely 4. You took extra portion of cheese twice and enjoyed it too much. That's at least 14 sins, 14 debts to the cosmic order, 14 strikes you owe to justice itself. You'll remove your habit and kneel on the cold stone floor of your cell. You'll pray for strength and guidance. Then you'll reach behind your back and begin the careful, deliberate work of salvation, one strike at a time. The theology of sacred pain, you're sitting in the monastery scriptorium 3 weeks later, your quill pen scratching across parchment as you copy a treatise on divine justice by St. Augustine. But you're not really concentrating on the Latin words flowing from your pen. Instead, you're thinking about pain, specifically the exquisite theology of sacred suffering that has become the cornerstone of your spiritual life. See, you weren't born into this understanding. You came to the monastery at 18, the third son of a minor nobleman who had no land to give you and no money for a decent marriage prospect. Your father saw the church as a practical solution to the problem of your existence, and you saw it as an escape from a world that had no place for you. You thought you were choosing prayer and contemplation, perhaps some scholarly work, copying manuscripts, and teaching young novices their letters. You had no idea you were enlisting in a war against your own flesh. Your first night in the dormitory, you were awakened by the sound of wet leather striking skin. Rhythmic, methodical, like someone beating a carpet, but with a different quality, more deliberate, more personal. You lay on your hard cot, listening to the sound coming from the cell next to yours, trying to understand what you were hearing. When you finally worked up the courage to ask Brother Francis the next morning, he looked at you with something between pity and envy. Brother Marcus was purifying his soul, he explained simply. He had impure thoughts during Vespers yesterday. But why hurt himself? You asked, genuinely confused. Couldn't he just pray for forgiveness? Brother Francis stopped walking and turned to face you fully. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they held a depth of conviction that made you step backward involuntarily. Prayer is words, Brother Thomas. Words are what got us into this mess in the first place. Eve listened to words. Adam spoke words of justification. The entire fall of man happened through words. But pain? Pain doesn't lie. Pain doesn't make excuses. Pain is truth in its purest form. That conversation changed everything for you. You began to pay attention during the theological discussions, to really listen when the abbot spoke about the nature of sin and redemption. You learned that the human body isn't just a vessel for the soul. It's a battleground where the war between good and evil is fought every single day. Your flesh wants comfort, pleasure, ease. Your soul wants holiness, purity, union with the divine. These desires are mutually exclusive, locked in eternal combat, and only one can win. The doctrine is actually quite logical when you break it down. Christ himself suffered on the cross to pay for human sin. His pain was redemptive, transformative, capable of changing the fundamental relationship between God and humanity. If Christ's suffering had that kind of power, then surely your suffering, offered in imitation of his sacrifice, must have some similar effect. Not the same magnitude, of course. You're not delusional, but proportional, meaningful, spiritually significant. You dip your quill again and continue copying Augustine's words. The body is the source of all temptation, the gateway through which sign enters the soul. Only by subjugating the flesh can the spirit achieve its proper dominance. As you write these words, you feel the familiar ache across your shoulders, where last night's discipline session opened several old wounds. The pain is constant now, a low throb that accompanies every movement, every breath. You've learned to find comfort in that ache, to read it like a spiritual barometer. When it's sharp and fresh, you know you're on the right path. When it starts to fade, you know it's time for another session. The monastery's library contains dozens of books on the subject of holy suffering. Saint Jerome wrote extensively about his own practices of self-mortification during his years in the Syrian desert. How he would beat his chest with stones until it was purple with bruises. How he would go days without food or water to bring his body into submission. Saint Benedict himself prescribed physical discipline as part of the monastic rule, though he was more moderate than some of the desert fathers who came before him. But it's the more recent writings that really speak to your condition. Peter Damian, who died just 200 years ago, developed an entire systematic approach to self-flagellation that reads like a military manual. He calculated exactly how many strikes were needed for different categories of sin. Minor infractions, impure thoughts, small acts of pride, momentary anger, required between 20 and 50 blows. More serious sins, deliberate disobedience, acts of sensuality, major breaches of humility, demanded between 100 and 300 strikes. The most severe transgressions could require up to 1,000 blows, administered over several sessions to prevent permanent injury or death. Peter Damian's writings include detailed instructions on the proper construction of scourges, the best times of day for discipline sessions, the correct posture and technique for maximum spiritual benefit. He treated self-flagellation as both an art and a science, something that could be perfected through practice and study. His followers, known as the Flagellants, spread across Europe, establishing communities dedicated entirely to the pursuit of redemption through pain. You've read these texts so many times you can quote entire passages from memory. But more than that, you've tested their principles in the laboratory of your own flesh. You know from direct experience that Peter Damian was right about the spiritual effects of properly administered discipline. After a thorough session, you feel lighter, cleaner, more connected to the divine than any amount of prayer or fasting has ever made you feel. Your mind becomes crystal clear. Your heart fills with genuine love for God and your fellow monks. Your soul achieves a state of peace that seems to lift you above the petty concerns of earthly existence. The other brothers report similar experiences. Brother Marcus describes entering a trance-like state during his longer sessions, sometimes receiving visions of angels or hearing the voice of Christ speaking directly to his heart. Brother Francis claims that his discipline practices have completely eliminated his tendency toward lustful thoughts, leaving his mind as pure as fresh snow. Brother David says the pain helps him understand, in some small way, what Christ suffered on the cross, creating a bond of shared experience that makes his prayers feel more authentic and powerful. These aren't the ravings of madmen. These are intelligent, educated men describing real spiritual phenomena that occur as a direct result of their disciplinary practices. The pain opens doorways in consciousness that remain closed to those who live in comfort. It creates a direct pathway between the physical and spiritual realms, allowing grace to flow more freely into hearts that have been properly prepared to receive it. You finish copying the page of Augustine and set down your quill, flexing your fingers to work out the cramps. Tonight is Friday, which means extended discipline session for all the brothers. You'll gather in the chapter house after Compline, each brother bringing his own scourge, and together you'll offer your collective suffering as a prayer for the souls in purgatory. The sound of 37 leather whips striking flesh simultaneously creates a kind of music, a percussion of devotion that rises like incense toward heaven. The culture of flesh. You're walking through the village of St. Denis on a gray Thursday morning in late October, your brown habit marking you clearly as one of the brothers from the monastery. The villagers nod respectfully as you pass, but you can see something else in their eyes, a mixture of fear, reverence, and morbid curiosity that you've learned to expect from those who live outside the cloister walls. They know what goes on inside the monastery. They've heard the stories, seen the blood-stained robes when the brothers come to town for market day. But they don't understand. How could they? You're here on business. The monastery needs salt for preserving winter meat, and Brother Cellera has sent you to negotiate with Merchant Pierre, who controls most of the salt trade in this region. But as you make your way through the narrow, muddy streets, you can't help but notice how different the world looks when you step outside the protective walls of your spiritual community. The people here live in their bodies in ways that would horrify you now. Women laugh too loudly, their voices carrying hints of sensuality that make you uncomfortable. Men drink wine in the middle of the day, their faces flushed with pleasure and indulgence. Children run through the streets with uninhibited joy, their bodies expressing emotions without any attempt at control or moderation. Everyone seems so unguarded, so vulnerable to the thousand temptations that lurk in every moment of unexamined existence. You pause outside the baker's shop, where the warm smell of fresh bread makes your stomach clench with hunger. You've been fasting since yesterday morning as penance for a moment of pride during Mass when Brother Francis stumbled over a Latin phrase and you felt superior. But the smell of that bread awakens every nerve ending in your body, reminding you forcefully that beneath your spiritual discipline, you're still an animal with animal needs and animal weaknesses. The baker's wife appears in the doorway, a woman of perhaps 30 with flour-dusted hands and a smile that seems to invite the whole world to share in her contentment. Brother Thomas, she calls, recognizing you from previous visits. Would you like to try my new honey cakes? I made them special for the feast of St. Martin next week. The temptation is immediate and powerful, not just a physical desire for sweetness, but something deeper, the longing to be part of this world of simple pleasures, uncomplicated relationships, lives lived on the surface of existence, without the constant excavation of sin. and the systematic destruction of comfort. For just a moment, you imagine what it would be like to be Thomas the baker instead of Brother Thomas the flagellant, to wake up next to a warm wife instead of on a wooden plank, to worry about the price of grain instead of the state of your immortal soul. "Thank you, Madame Isabel," you say carefully, "but I'm fasting today." She nods understandingly, but you catch a flicker of something in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or confusion. She doesn't understand why anyone would choose hunger when food is available, why someone would deliberately make life harder than it has to be. To her, your fasting probably seems like madness, a rejection of God's gifts rather than an offering to God's glory. You continue through the village, passing the tavern where you can hear male voices raised in song, the courtyard where two young men are practicing swordplay, the garden where an old woman sits in the afternoon sun mending clothes with quick practiced fingers. All of these people are living their lives without the constant awareness of sin that colors every moment of your existence. They're not better or worse than you. They're just different, operating from a completely different understanding of what human life is supposed to be. But here's what they don't see, what they can't understand. Their very comfort is a form of spiritual poverty. Their satisfaction with the pleasures of the flesh prevents them from discovering the far greater pleasures of the spirit. They've never experienced the intense clarity that comes after a proper flagellation session. Never felt the overwhelming love of God that fills the empty spaces left when pride and sensuality are beaten out of your heart. They think they're free, but they're actually slaves to their appetites, prisoners of their own comfort. You arrive at Merchant Pierre's shop and spend the next hour negotiating the price of salt, your mind only half focused on the transaction. Pierre is a shrewd businessman who tries to take advantage of what he assumes is monastic naivety about worldly matters. He doesn't realize that your years of rigorous self-examination have taught you to read people with almost supernatural accuracy. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every shift in posture reveals the underlying motivations that drive human behavior. When you see through his initial deception and counter with a price that's fair but firm, his respect for you increases noticeably. "You brothers," he says as he measures out the salt, "you're tougher than people think." Toughness is developed through practice. You reply mildly, like any other skill. He wraps the salt in oilcloth and ties it with hemp rope, but he doesn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he studies your face with curious eyes. "Can I ask you something, brother? Man to man?" You nod, though you're immediately on guard. These conversations rarely go well. "Why do you hurt yourselves?" "I mean, I hear things. People talk. They say you brothers whip yourselves until you bleed, that you sleep on wooden planks, that you fast until you can barely stand. What's the point? If God loves us, why would he want us to suffer?" This is the question you get most often from people outside the monastery, and you've learned to answer it carefully. Not everyone is ready to understand the deeper truths of spiritual discipline, and trying to explain advanced theology to someone who's never progressed beyond basic prayer is like trying to teach calculus to a child who can barely count. Think of it this way. You say slowly, "A blacksmith heats iron in the forge to make it stronger. A farmer prunes his vines to make them bear more fruit. A sculptor chips away stone to reveal the statue hidden inside." Pain isn't the goal. Transformation is. We endure temporary suffering because it produces permanent spiritual growth. Pierre nods slowly, but you can see he's not entirely convinced. "But why can't you just pray? Why does it have to hurt?" "Prayer is important," you acknowledge. "But prayer alone is like trying to climb a mountain using only your voice. Your intentions might be pure, but you need more than good intentions to reach the summit. You need strength, endurance, the willingness to push through discomfort and exhaustion. Spiritual discipline develops those qualities in the soul. And the bleeding? Is that really necessary?" You're quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth this man can handle. "Blood is life," you finally say. "When we offer our blood freely in imitation of Christ's sacrifice, we're giving the most precious thing we have." is not about the pain itself. It's about the willingness to give everything, even our comfort, even our bodies, for the sake of something greater than ourselves. Peer hands you the wrapped salt, but his expression remains troubled. I don't know, brother. It seems to me that God gave us bodies to enjoy them, not to destroy them. And God gave us souls to purify them. You counter gently. The question is which gift you consider more important. You leave the shop with your salt and begin the walk back to the monastery. But Peer's words follow you like an unwelcome echo. This is the fundamental divide between your world and theirs. The gulf that separates those who have accepted the necessity of spiritual discipline from those who still believe that comfort and holiness can coexist. They see your practices as extreme, perhaps even insane. You see their complacency as spiritually dangerous, a form of slow suicide that kills the soul through kindness. As you approach the monastery gates, you feel a familiar sense of relief, like a soldier returning to base camp after a reconnaissance mission in enemy territory. Here, behind these stone walls, everyone understands the rules of engagement in the war against sin. Here, pain has meaning, suffering has purpose, and the systematic destruction of bodily comfort is recognized as the highest form of spiritual art. The porter opens the gate for you with a knowing smile. How are the villagers today, Brother Thomas? The same as always, you reply, asleep in their bodies, dreaming they're awake. The Brotherhood of Blood, you're kneeling in the chapter house at midnight, surrounded by your fellow brothers in a circle that has become as familiar as family, as necessary as breathing. The room is lit only by a single candle placed at the center of the circle, its flame casting dancing shadows on the stone walls that have witnessed this ritual hundreds of times. Each brother kneels on the cold floor with his scourge laid carefully beside him, the leather strips and iron beads gleaming dully in the flickering light. This is the monthly communal discipline, a practice that transforms individual penance into collective prayer, personal suffering into shared sacrifice. Tonight you will offer your pain, not for your own sins alone, but for the spiritual welfare of the entire community, for the souls in purgatory, for the conversion of heretics and infidels, for the salvation of the world itself. This is liturgy written in blood, theology expressed through the systematic destruction of flesh. Abbot Bernard stands in the center of the circle, his own scourge already in his hands. At 63, he's been practicing these disciplines longer than you've been alive, and his back is a landscape of old scars layered over older scars. White lines and raised ridges that tell the story of decades spent in pursuit of perfect contrition. When he removes his habit tonight, you'll see the evidence of a lifetime devoted to the proposition that holiness requires sacrifice. That spiritual growth demands the systematic conquest of physical comfort. Brothers, he begins, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. We gather tonight in imitation of our blessed Savior, who shed his blood for the redemption of mankind. What we offer is infinitely smaller than his sacrifice, but the principle is the same. Only through suffering can sin be conquered. Only through pain can purity be achieved. You've heard these words dozens of times, but they still send a thrill of anticipation through your body. Around the circle, you can see the same response in your fellow brothers. The slight straightening of shoulders, the deepening of breath, the mental preparation for what's about to come. Brother Marcus closes his eyes and begins moving his lips in silent prayer. Brother Francis flexes his fingers around the handle of his scourge, testing the grip. Brother David tilts his head back slightly, as if already offering his suffering to heaven. Tonight we discipline ourselves for the sins of pride that separate us from God. Abbot Bernard continues. For the sins of lust that pollute our hearts. For the sins of anger that poison our relationships with one another. For the sins of greed that make us forget our vows of poverty. For the sins of gluttony that enslave us to our appetites. For the sins of envy that corrupt our brotherhood. For the sins of sloth that prevent us from serving God with our whole strength. As he speaks, each brother removes his habit, folding it carefully and setting it aside. In the candlelight, 37 pale bodies are revealed. each one marked with the evidence of previous discipline sessions. Some are fresh wounds, red and raw from recent nights of penance. Others are older scars, white and silver against skin that has been repeatedly broken and healed. Together, they create a kind of visual testimony to the depth of commitment that binds this community together. You remove your own habit, feeling the familiar tug as the rough wool pulls away from scabs that have formed over yesterday's wounds. The cool air touches your back, and immediately every nerve ending becomes alert, sensitive, ready for what's about to happen. You pick up your scourge and run your fingers along the leather strips, checking for loose beads or frayed ends that might cause uneven strikes. This is serious work that requires proper tools maintained in perfect condition. We begin with examination of conscience, Abba Bernard announces. Let each brother search his heart for the sins committed since our last gathering, and let the number of his sins determine the number of his strokes. The room fills with the soft murmur of whispered prayers as each brother conducts his private inventory of failures and transgressions. You close your eyes and let your mind drift back over the past month, systematically reviewing each day for moments of weakness, instances of pride, lapses in perfect obedience to the rule of Saint Benedict. There was the morning when you felt superior to Brother Paul during theological discussion, correcting his interpretation of Augustine with perhaps too much satisfaction. Pride. 5 strikes. The afternoon when you lingered too long watching Sister Catherine from the convent as she worked in the herb garden, allowing yourself to appreciate the curve of her neck, the graceful movement of her hands. Lust. 10 strikes. The evening when you took 2 portions of bread at dinner because you were genuinely hungry from fasting, but enjoyed the second portion more than was strictly necessary. Gluttony. 3 strikes. And those are just the obvious sins, the ones you can identify and categorize. What about the more subtle failings? The moment of irritation when Brother Marcus asked you to help him with his copying work when you were busy with your own project. The flash of envy when Abbot Bernard praised Brother Francis's illuminated manuscripts. The tendency to rush through certain prayers because you were tired or distracted. How many strikes do those deserve? You settle on 42 strikes total, a number that feels proportional to your failures without being excessive. Around the circle, you can see your brothers reaching their own conclusions, some settling on smaller numbers, others preparing for more extensive penance. Brother Marcus, who struggles constantly with angry thoughts, often requires 60 or 70 strikes. Brother Francis, whose lustful tendencies seem stronger than most, sometimes reaches 100. Brothers, Abba Bernard says quietly, let us begin. The sound starts as a whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the candle flame. Leather striking flesh in 37 different rhythms, creating a complex percussion that seems to fill the stone chamber with sacred music. Each brother works according to his own count, his own assessment of sin, his own understanding of what justice requires. But together, the sound becomes something larger than its individual parts. A symphony of contrition, a chorus of redemption, a communal prayer offered in the only language that seems adequate to express the depth of spiritual need. You begin your own count, drawing the scourge back over your right shoulder and bringing it down across your back with controlled force. 1. The leather strips. Bite into skin that's still tender from recent sessions, and immediately you feel the familiar burn of broken flesh, the warm trickle of blood beginning its slow journey down your ribs. 2. The iron beads embedded in the leather tips create sharp points of concentrated pain, each one a small exclamation point in the sentence your discipline is writing across your back. 3. As you continue, you become aware of the sound around you. Brother Marcus grunting softly with effort. Brother Francis whispering Latin prayers between strikes. Brother David's scourge making a different sound because his is weighted with small lead balls instead of iron beads. The individual rhythms begin to synchronize slightly, not deliberately, but naturally, as if the shared purpose is creating a kind of musical harmony from the chaos of separate penances. 10 strikes, 20, 30. Your back is fully awakened now, every nerve ending activated. The pain sharp and clean and somehow purifying. This is what the villagers don't understand. What Pierre the merchant couldn't grasp. Pain isn't the enemy of joy. It's the gateway to a deeper, more authentic form of happiness. When you strip away comfort, pleasure, the thousand small indulgences that normally cushion your existence, what remains is clarity. Pure, undiluted spiritual awareness that makes every breath feel like a prayer, every heartbeat like a hymn of gratitude. 35, 40. Your count is almost complete, but you're reluctant to stop. The pain has opened some door in your consciousness, some pathway between the physical and spiritual realms that allows grace to flow into your heart like water into a prepared vessel. You feel connected not just to God, but to every brother in this circle, to every saint who ever suffered for holiness, to Christ himself hanging on the cross. Your individual identity begins to dissolve into something larger, more universal, more real than the small self that worries about daily concerns and personal comfort. 42. You set down your scourge and remain kneeling, breathing heavily, feeling the warm blood cooling against your skin. Around the circle, the other brothers are finishing their own counts, the sound of leather against flesh gradually diminishing until only Brother Marcus continues, working through what appears to be an extensive penance. Finally, even he stops, setting his scourge aside with a soft exhale, that satisfaction. Brothers, Abba Bernard says softly, let us pray. Together, you recite the Te Deum, your voices rising in Latin harmony that seems to transform the chapter house into a cathedral, the stone walls into pillars of heaven itself. The words take on new meaning when offered from bodies that have just been willingly broken in service of spiritual truth. We praise thee, O God. We acknowledge thee to be the Lord. All the earth doth worship thee, the Father everlasting. When the prayer ends, the brothers begin to file out silently, returning to their cells to tend their wounds and sleep the deep, peaceful sleep that follows proper discipline. You remain kneeling for a few extra minutes, unwilling to break the spell of communion that still fills your heart. This is why you became a monk, though you didn't know it at the time. Not for the intellectual satisfaction of copying manuscripts or the sole respectability of religious life, but for moments like this, when the barriers between self and divine dissolve completely, when pain becomes prayer and blood becomes blessing. The art of sacred wounds. You're sitting in the monastery's infirmary 2 days after the communal discipline session, waiting for Brother Matthias to examine the wounds on your back. The room smells of herbs and vinegar, honey and blood, the familiar fragrances of a place where pain is treated as both medicine and sacrament. Brother Matthias has been the monastery's healer for 23 years, and his hands have tended thousands of self-inflicted injuries, each one offering its own lessons about the relationship between flesh and spirit. Remove your habit, Brother Thomas, he says quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who has seen every possible variety of human suffering. Let's see what we're working with today. You pull the rough wool over your head, feeling the familiar tug as dried blood pulls away from partially healed scabs. Brother Matthias examines your back with the practiced eye of a master craftsman evaluating his work, his fingers tracing the lines of fresh wounds and older scars with professional detachment. But you know him well enough to recognize the deeper appreciation in his touch. This isn't just medical treatment. It's spiritual counseling conducted through the medium of damaged flesh. "Good clean strikes," he murmurs approvingly. "Consistent depth, proper spacing. You're learning to read your own body, understanding exactly how much force is needed to break the skin without causing dangerous tissue damage. This is important work, brother. The difference between effective discipline and harmful mutilation often comes down to technique." He dips a clean cloth in a solution of wine and herbs, then begins gently cleaning each wound. The alcohol burns against your raw flesh, but it's a different kind of pain than the sharp bite of the scourge. Cleaner, more medicinal, purposeful in a different way. As he works, Brother Matthias talks quietly about the philosophy of sacred wounds, the theology of properly maintained injuries. The Desert Fathers understood something that modern monks sometimes forget. He says, dabbing carefully at a particularly deep cut near your left shoulder blade. The body isn't just the enemy of the soul, it's also the soul's most intimate collaborator. When we damage the flesh carelessly, we lose the opportunity for genuine spiritual growth. But when we wound ourselves with proper intention and technique, the body becomes a partner in the work of sanctification. You've heard variations of this lecture before, but it never loses its fascination. Brother Matthias has developed an entire science of spiritual wounds, a systematic approach to self-injury that maximizes spiritual benefit while minimizing physical risk. He can tell from the pattern of scars on a monk's back exactly what kind of spiritual struggles the person is facing, what particular sins he's battling, how advanced he is in the practice of holy discipline. Look at this, he says, indicating a cluster of older scars across your right shoulder. These are from your first 6 months here, when you were still learning proper technique. See how irregular they are? Some too deep, others barely scratching the surface. Your spiritual focus was scattered, trying to address too many different failings at once instead of concentrating on systematic improvement. He moves to a different area of your back, pointing to a series of parallel lines that run from your shoulders toward your spine. But these are from last winter, during Lent. Much more controlled, deliberate. You were working on pride specifically, weren't you? I can tell because the strikes are perfectly measured, spaced exactly 2 finger widths apart. You had developed enough self-knowledge to target specific spiritual weaknesses instead of just beating yourself randomly. This kind of analysis fascinates you because it reveals the hidden logic of practices that must seem completely insane to outsiders. To Pierre the merchant or Madame Isabel the baker's wife, your scarred back would look like evidence of mental illness, the random damage inflicted by someone who had lost all reason. But to Brother Matthias's trained eye, these wounds tell a coherent story of spiritual development, a visual record of a soul's methodical progress toward holiness. He applies a mixture of honey and crushed herbs to each fresh wound, the sweetness creating a strange counterpoint to the lingering burn of the alcohol wash. Honey prevents infection, he explains as he works, but it also has symbolic significance. The sweetness reminds us that all suffering, properly offered, becomes a source of spiritual joy. The stinging you feel now will transform into deeper peace over the next few days. As he tends your injuries, Brother Matthias tells you about some of the more challenging cases he's treated over the years. Brother Augustine, who died 3 years before you arrived, used to practice such severe disciplines that his back was permanently damaged, the muscles and tendons scarred beyond repair. But instead of becoming bitter or discouraged, he developed an even deeper spirituality, claiming that his physical limitations forced him to find God through different pathways: intense prayer, mystical contemplation, service to others. Then there was Brother Simon, who went to the opposite extreme, inflicting such minor injuries that they barely qualified as penance at all. He was afraid of real pain, Brother Matthias explains, so he convinced himself that symbolic gestures were sufficient for spiritual growth. But his lack of commitment showed in every aspect of his monastic life. Lazy prayer, casual observance of the rule, no real progress toward the humility and self-denial that define true holiness. The goal, Brother Matthias says as he begins wrapping clean linen around your torso to protect the treated wounds, is to find the balance between extremes. Enough pain to genuinely challenge your attachment to comfort, but not so much that you damage your body beyond repair. Remember, we're trying to purify the flesh, not destroy it completely. He steps back to examine his work, the white bandages stark against your pale skin. These should heal properly in about a week if you're careful. Try not to let them stick to your habit. Apply a little oil each morning to keep the cloth from adhering to the scabs. And remember, healing is part of the spiritual process too. The the way wounds close, the way new skin forms over damaged tissue. That's a physical metaphor for how grace repairs the damage that sin does to the soul. You put your habit back on, feeling the soft pressure of the bandages against your back. Brother Matthias makes a few notes in his records, documenting the extent and nature of your injuries for future reference. These records serve multiple purposes. They track each monk's spiritual progress through the evidence of his physical discipline, but they also provide data for understanding the long-term effects of different flagellation techniques. One more thing, Brother Thomas. He says as you prepare to leave the infirmary, I want you to pay attention to how these wounds heal over the next week. Notice the different stages. The initial sharp pain, the dull ache that follows, the itching as new skin forms, the gradual return to normal sensation. Each phase has something to teach you about the process of spiritual recovery from sin. You nod and turn to go, but he stops you with a gentle hand on your arm. And remember, these scars you're developing aren't disfigurements. They're illuminations, like the decorative letters you paint in your manuscripts. Each one is a small masterpiece of devotion, a permanent prayer written in the most honest language your body knows how to speak. Wear them with pride, brother. In the true sense of that word. Walking back to your cell, you feel the weight of Brother Matthias's words settling into your consciousness, like seeds planted in fertile ground. The bandages around your torso are a reminder not just of pain endured, but of love expressed in the most direct way possible. Every step sends small echoes of discomfort through your back, and each twinge feels like a whispered promise. This suffering has meaning. This damage serves a purpose. This destruction is actually a form of creation. Tonight you'll kneel beside your narrow cot and examine your conscience as always, counting sins and calculating the debt of strikes you owe to divine justice. But now you'll do it with deeper understanding of what you're really accomplishing. You're not just punishing yourself for moral failures. You're participating in the ancient art of transformation, using your own flesh as both canvas and brush to paint a portrait of a soul in the process of becoming holy. The economics of pain. You're standing in the monastery's treasury on a cold February morning, helping Brother Cellerer count the monastery's assets for the annual report to the bishop. The room is small and windowless, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across chests filled with silver coins, gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, and other valuables accumulated over centuries of monastic life. But as you handle these material treasures, your mind keeps returning to a different kind of wealth entirely. The spiritual economy of suffering that has become the real currency of your existence. Brother Cellerer is a practical man in his 50s who joined the monastery after a successful career as a merchant in Paris. He understands money, property, and the worldly mechanics of keeping a religious community financially solvent. But he also understands something deeper. The way spiritual disciplines create their own form of value, measurable not in coins, but in the transformation of human character. Look at this, he says, lifting a jeweled reliquary from one of the chests. This contains a fragment of bone from Saint Denis himself, the patron of our monastery. The bishop values it at 300 silver pieces for insurance purposes. But what's it really worth? To a believer, it's priceless. To a skeptic, it's worthless. Value depends entirely on what you're willing to sacrifice to obtain something. He sets the reliquary down carefully and turns to face you directly. The same principle applies to what we do to ourselves each night in our cells, Brother Thomas. To the outside world, our disciplines look like madness. Grown men deliberately injuring themselves for no apparent benefit. But to us, each drop of blood we shed is an investment in spiritual growth that pays dividends in ways that can't be measured in earthly terms. This conversation fascinates you because it makes explicit something you've been thinking about for months. The way pain functions as a form of currency in the spiritual economy. Something you can spend to purchase states of consciousness that aren't available through any other means. When you inflict 40 strikes on your back, you're not just expressing remorse for 40 sins. You're making a down payment on the kind of person you want to become. Brother Cellarer opens his ledger and begins recording the contents of each chest, his neat handwriting documenting the monastery's material wealth with merchant precision. But as he works, he continues talking about the economics of monasticism, the way communities like yours create value through practices that seem to destroy it. Before I came here, he says, counting gold coins into neat stacks, I thought wealth meant accumulation, gathering more money, property, possessions than I could possibly use. I measured success by how much I could acquire and keep. But monastic life has taught me that real wealth comes from learning what you can live without. He pauses in his counting and looks directly at you. Every comfort you surrender, every pleasure you deny yourself, every moment of pain you accept willingly, these aren't losses, brother. They're investments in a form of capital that appreciates rather than depreciates over time. The more you sacrifice now, the richer you become in the qualities that actually matter: patience, humility, compassion, spiritual insight. You help him inventory a collection of silver cups and plates, each piece representing donations from wealthy families who wanted to support the monastery's work. As you handle these beautiful objects, you think about the paradox they represent: material wealth, given away to support a community dedicated to the rejection of material comfort. The nobles who donated these treasures understood intuitively that their own spiritual welfare required them to fund institutions committed to practices they couldn't imagine adopting themselves. The fascinating thing about our disciplines, Brother Cellarer continues, is how they reverse the normal economic logic. In the outside world, people spend money to avoid pain. They buy comfortable beds, soft clothes, rich food, entertainment, anything that makes life easier and more pleasant. But we spend pain to avoid spiritual poverty. We invest suffering to purchase insights that money can't buy. He shows you a letter from the bishop requesting a detailed accounting of the monastery's expenses, particularly the costs associated with maintaining the community's disciplinary practices. The secular authorities have trouble understanding why the church should support institutions that seem deliberately self-destructive, and they want documentation proving that monastic communities provide value proportional to their cost. How do you calculate the value of a properly disciplined soul? Brother Cellarer asks rhetorically. How do you quantify the benefit to society of men who have learned to control their appetites, overcome their pride, channel their aggression into spiritual growth instead of worldly conflict? The villages around here are more peaceful because we exist. The people sleep better knowing that someone is taking responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the entire region. This is something you've never considered before. The way your individual practices of self-flagellation contribute to the social good of the broader community. When you kneel in your cell each night and methodically strike yourself for your failures and weaknesses, you're not just working on your own salvation. You're creating a kind of spiritual surplus that benefits everyone around you. Your pain becomes a form of prayer for people who don't know how to pray for themselves. Your discipline a source of strength for those who lack the knowledge or courage to undertake serious spiritual work. Brother Cellarer closes his ledger and locks the treasury chests, but his expression remains thoughtful. There's something else about the economics of suffering that the outside world doesn't understand. He says, pain is one of the few things that becomes more valuable the more you give it away. When we gather for communal discipline sessions, when we offer our individual suffering as collective prayer, the spiritual benefit multiplies rather than divides. 37 men disciplining themselves together create more than 37 times the effect of one man disciplining himself alone. You walk with him back toward the main part of the monastery, passing through corridors where the smell of cooking bread mingles with the fainter but persistent odor of the herbs Brother Matthias uses to treat disciplinary wounds. The combination creates an olfactory reminder of the monastery's dual nature, a place where basic human needs are met simply and efficiently, but where the real focus is on needs that transcend the merely human. The ultimate irony Brother Cellerer says as you reach the door to his administrative office, is that our economy of pain actually produces more genuine joy than most people's economy of pleasure. When you've truly earned peace through suffering, when you've purchased spiritual insight with the coin of physical discomfort, the happiness that results has a depth and durability that no amount of worldly enjoyment can match. He pauses with his hand on the door latch, looking back at you with the expression of someone who has discovered a secret too valuable to keep entirely to himself. That's why we can afford to give away everything else, Brother Thomas. Property, comfort, pleasure, even our bodies. These are all just capital to be invested in the only enterprise that offers guaranteed returns. The systematic transformation of human nature through voluntary suffering. As you return to your copying work in the scriptorium, Brother Cellerer's words echo in your mind like a mathematical proof that finally makes sense of an equation you've been struggling to solve. Every night when you pick up your scourge, you're not just engaging in religious ritual. You're participating in an economic system that operates according to laws completely opposite to those governing the material world. In this economy, the more you spend, the richer you become. The more you lose, the more you gain. The more you suffer, the more joy becomes available to you. Tonight, you'll kneel beside your cot and conduct your usual examination of conscience, counting sins and calculating strikes. But now you'll do it with the awareness that you're not just balancing a spiritual ledger. You're investing in a form of wealth that compounds daily, that can never be stolen or lost, that grows stronger every time you're willing to pay its price. The science of sacred suffering. You're in the monastery library on a snowy March afternoon, poring over a manuscript that Brother Augustine copied before his death 3 years ago, the Disciplina Corporali, on bodily discipline, a comprehensive treatise on the physiological and spiritual effects of systematic self-flagellation. The parchment is filled with detailed anatomical drawings showing the proper angles for striking, precise measurements for scourge construction, and elaborate charts documenting the relationship between different types of physical pain and specific spiritual outcomes. This isn't the random violence that outsiders imagine when they think about monastic discipline. This is science, rigorous, methodical, based on centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Brother Augustine spent 37 years studying the effects of various flagellation techniques on his own body and the bodies of his fellow monks, documenting his findings with the same precision that ancient Greek physicians used to study anatomy and disease. The manuscript begins with basic principles. The human body contains exactly 2,847 nerve pathways capable of transmitting pain signals to the consciousness. Each pathway responds differently to various forms of stimulation. The spiritual practitioner who understands these differences can target specific areas of sensation to achieve particular states of divine awareness. You turn the page and find detailed diagrams showing the optimal placement of strikes across the back, shoulders, and upper arms. Brother Augustine identified 17 distinct zones, each corresponding to different spiritual challenges. Zone 1, just below the neck, is most effective for combating pride. Zone 5, across the shoulder blades, produces the deepest contrition for sins of lust. Zone 12, near the kidneys, generates the most profound awareness of mortality and the need for salvation. But the real revelation in this manuscript is Brother Augustine's discovery of what he calls the rhythm of redemption, the precise timing and sequence of strikes that can induce states of mystical consciousness. According to his research, random flagellation produces only physical pain with minimal spiritual benefit. But strikes delivered in specific patterns, with carefully calculated intervals between each blow, can trigger profound alterations in awareness that allow direct communication with the divine. The sacred rhythm, Brother Augustine writes, consists of 7 strikes delivered in rapid succession, followed by a pause lasting exactly 12 heartbeats, then 3 more strikes, another pause of 7 heartbeats, then a final single strike that completes the cycle. This pattern, repeated 9 times for a total of 99 strikes, creates a vibrational frequency that resonates with the deepest structures of the soul. You've experimented with variations of this technique in your own discipline sessions, and the results have been remarkable. When you follow Brother Augustine's rhythm precisely, counting your heartbeats between strikes, maintaining exact timing despite the increasing pain, something extraordinary happens. The individual sensations of leather against flesh begin to merge into a single continuous experience, like separate notes combining to form a chord. Your consciousness shifts into a different mode of operation, one where pain becomes indistinguishable from ecstasy, where the boundaries between self and divine begin to dissolve. The manuscript includes testimonials from monks who achieved various states of spiritual enlightenment through proper application of these techniques. Brother Matthias, not the current infirmarian, but his predecessor with the same name, reported receiving visions of angels during disciplinary sessions conducted according to the sacred rhythm. Brother Francis claimed to have heard the voice of Christ, speaking directly to his heart during a particularly intense flagellation sequence. Brother Thomas, your namesake, who died 40 years before your birth, wrote detailed descriptions of out-of-body experiences where his consciousness seemed to separate from his suffering flesh and observe the discipline session from above. These aren't the fantasies of deluded fanatics. These are careful, detailed accounts of altered states of consciousness produced through specific physical practices, documented by intelligent men with extensive education in theology, philosophy, and natural science. Brother Augustine's treatise includes a lengthy section on the physiological mechanisms that might explain these phenomena, drawing on the medical knowledge available in his time to theorize about how intense pain might affect the balance of bodily humors and create conditions conducive to mystical experience. When the flesh is properly disciplined, he writes, the excess heat generated by repeated striking drives the corrupt humors from the blood, purifying the body's internal environment. This purification allows the soul to perceive divine truths that are normally obscured by the fog of physical comfort and worldly distraction. Pain becomes a burning away of illusion, revealing the spiritual reality that underlies all material existence. You turn to a section titled Advanced Techniques for the Experienced Practitioner and find descriptions of flagellation methods so extreme they make your own practices seem moderate by comparison. Brother Augustine documents experiments with scourges weighted with lead balls, chains studded with iron spikes, even instruments designed to create specific patterns of wounds that form symbolic designs across the monk's back. Crosses, sacred letters, geometric shapes that represent theological concepts. But he's careful to warn against attempting these advanced techniques without proper preparation and supervision. The inexperienced practitioner who attempts to shortcut the developmental process risks physical injury without spiritual benefit. He writes, like any art, sacred flagellation requires years of patient study and gradual progression. The flesh must be slowly educated to accept higher levels of purifying pain, just as the mind must be gradually trained to interpret these sensations as forms of divine communication. There's even a section on seasonal variations in disciplinary practice, based on Brother Augustine's observation that the body's response to pain changes throughout the year. During winter, when the blood runs colder and the skin is less sensitive, more intensive flagellation is required to achieve the same spiritual effects. Summer practices must be modified to account for increased risk of infection and the body's heightened response to physical trauma. Spring and autumn offer optimal conditions for advancement to new levels of disciplinary intensity. As you read these detailed instructions, you're struck by the paradox they represent. This manuscript contains some of the most sophisticated psychological and physiological insights you've ever encountered. Yet, it's devoted entirely to the systematic destruction of human flesh. Brother Augustine understood the human body with scientific precision, but only so he could damage it more effectively. He studied pain the way other scholars study mathematics or astronomy, as a pathway to ultimate truth about the nature of reality. The final section of the treatise addresses the question that haunts every serious practitioner of sacred discipline. How do you know when you've suffered enough? When does penance become adequate to balance the weight of sin? Brother Augustine's answer is both simple and profound. You have suffered enough when suffering becomes unnecessary. You have disciplined yourself adequately when discipline becomes natural. You have purified your flesh sufficiently when the distinction between pain and pleasure disappears entirely. You close the manuscript and sit back in your chair, feeling the familiar ache across your shoulders, where last night's discipline session opened several old wounds. Brother Augustine's words echo in your mind like a challenge. How close are you to that ultimate goal he describes? How many more nights of careful flagellation will be required before you achieve the state of perfect spiritual balance, where pain becomes indistinguishable from joy? Tonight you'll return to your cell and continue the patient work of transformation. But now, with deeper understanding of the science behind your practices, you'll count your heartbeats between strikes. Maintain the sacred rhythm that Brother Augustine discovered through decades of experimentation, and perhaps move one step closer to the mystical states of consciousness that have always seemed just beyond your reach. The snow continues falling outside the library windows, but inside these stone walls, you're surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of men who understood that real knowledge comes not from books alone, but from the systematic exploration of consciousness through the careful application of pain to willing flesh. The politics of flesh. You're sitting in the chapter house on a gray April morning, listening to Abbot Bernard read a letter from Cardinal Beaumont in Paris. The cardinal's words carry the weight of ecclesiastical authority, but also something else, a note of concern, perhaps even disapproval. That makes you shift uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench where you sit with your fellow brothers. His Eminence writes that reports of our disciplinary practices have reached certain members of the papal court. Abbot Bernard announces, his voice carefully neutral. There are questions about whether our interpretations of monastic discipline align with current church doctrine regarding the proper treatment of the human body. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the cold stone walls surrounding you. For the past 4 years, you've lived in a world where your practices of self-flagellation were not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of spiritual achievement. The idea that church authorities might question these disciplines feels like questioning the fundamental laws of physics. How can something so obviously true suddenly become controversial? The letter continues with phrases that seem to dance around their real meaning. Concerns about excessive practices, the need for moderation in all things, reports of injuries that may exceed the bounds of reasonable penance. Cardinal Beaumont doesn't explicitly condemn your community's flagellation practices, but his words carry the unmistakable implication that someone with serious authority is paying attention to what happens behind your monastery walls. After the reading, Abbot Bernard dismisses the brothers to their daily work, but asks you and several others to remain for private discussion. When the chapter house is emptied, except for the monastery's senior monks, the abbot's careful composure finally cracks, revealing the concern he's been hiding. Brothers, he says quietly, we may be entering a period of trial. The church hierarchy is becoming uncomfortable with the more rigorous forms of monastic discipline. There are political pressures I don't fully understand, influences from Rome that seem to favor what they call spiritual practices more suitable to our changing times. Brother Francis raises his hand tentatively. Father Abbot, are we doing something wrong? Our practices are based on centuries of monastic tradition, supported by the writings of Saint Jerome, Saint Benedict, countless holy fathers who achieved sanctity through exactly the disciplines we follow. Abbot Bernard nods wearily. That's what makes this situation so difficult, Brother Francis. We're not innovating or exceeding traditional bounds. If anything, our practices are more moderate than those of the Desert Fathers, more systematic than the spontaneous mortifications of many saints. But the political climate is changing. There are voices in the church arguing for what they call reform, a softening of traditional disciplines, a focus on internal spirituality rather than external practices. You listen to this conversation with growing disbelief. How can practices that have produced such profound spiritual results suddenly become politically problematic? How can the systematic pursuit of holiness through voluntary suffering become a source of ecclesiastical controversy? But as Abba Bernard continues explaining the larger context, you begin to understand the forces at work. The Church is facing criticism from secular authorities who question the value of monastic communities that seem to contribute nothing to the economic welfare of their regions. Kings and nobles are beginning to view extensive church properties as resources that could be better utilized for worldly purposes. In this climate, monasteries that engage in practices outsiders consider extreme or disturbing become easy targets for political pressure. There's also the question of recruitment. Brother Cellerer adds grimly. Enrollment in monastic communities across Europe has been declining for the past decade. Young men who might once have seen religious life as an attractive alternative to military service or merchant work are choosing different paths. Some church authorities believe our disciplinary practices make monastic life seem too harsh, too demanding for potential candidates. The irony is crushing. The very practices that have made your spiritual life so meaningful, that have connected you to God in ways you never imagined possible, are now seen as obstacles to the Church's institutional survival. The disciplines that have transformed you from a comfortable young nobleman into someone capable of genuine spiritual insight are being reconsidered as public relations problems. Abba Bernard pulls out another document, this one bearing the seal of the bishop. His Excellency has requested that we prepare a detailed report explaining our disciplinary practices, including medical documentation of any injury sustained, theological justification for our methods, and evidence that our community contributes positively to the spiritual welfare of the surrounding region. This is not a request for information. It's the beginning of an investigation. Someone with serious authority wants to build a case, either for or against your community's continued existence. And the evidence you provide will determine which direction that case develops. Everything you've built over the past 4 years, your personal spiritual progress, your bonds with your brother monks, your sense of having found a meaningful way to live, now depends on your ability to defend practices that have always seemed self-evidently valuable. I want each of you to prepare written statements, Abba Bernard continues, describing your personal experience with our disciplinary practices. Focus on the spiritual benefits you've received, the ways these disciplines have helped you overcome particular sins or develop specific virtues. Be honest, but also be strategic. Remember that your words will be read by people who have never experienced what we do here, who may not understand the logic of voluntary suffering. Over the following days, you spend hours crafting your statement, trying to find language that will make sense to ecclesiastical bureaucrats who live comfortable lives in heated palaces, who've never felt the clarifying burn of leather against flesh or experienced the mystical states that proper flagellation can induce. How do you explain to someone who sleeps on soft mattresses and eats rich food that destroying physical comfort can produce spiritual joy? How do you make a case for practices that must seem like madness to anyone who hasn't lived them? You write about the precision of your disciplines, the way Brother Augustine's scientific approach ensures maximum spiritual benefit with minimal physical risk. You describe the communal aspects of your flagellation practices, the way shared suffering creates bonds of brotherhood stronger than any secular loyalty. You document the concrete improvements in your character, the reduction in prideful thoughts, the increased capacity for genuine humility, the growing sense of connection to divine love that makes every day feel like a gift. But even as you write these words, you can imagine how they'll sound to skeptical readers, the people who've never experienced the spiritual economy of pain. Your testimony will probably seem like the rationalizations of damaged men who've convinced themselves that self-destruction is holiness. The completed reports are sent to the bishop, and now you wait. Daily life in the monastery continues as always. Prayer services, copying work, communal discipline sessions. But everything feels precarious, temporary, as if you're living in a bubble that could burst at any moment. The practices that once felt eternal and unchanging now seem fragile, dependent on the approval of men who may not understand their value. Brother Marcus has started having nightmares about being forced to leave the monastery, returning to the secular world without the spiritual tools that have become essential to his survival. Brother Francis has become obsessed with perfecting his flagellation technique, as if achieving some new level of disciplinary precision might prove the worth of your community to its critics. Even Brother Matthias seems nervous, second-guessing medical decisions that once felt routine. You continue your nightly disciplines, but they've taken on new urgency. Each strike of the scourge feels like a prayer for your community's survival. Each drop of blood, an offering not just for your own sins, but for the wisdom of church authorities who hold your future in their hands. The pain has always been meaningful, but now it's also political, a form of testimony in a trial, where the stakes are nothing less than your ability to continue living the only life that has ever made sense to you. The heresy of comfort. You're kneeling in your cell at 3 in the morning, scourge in hand, but tonight something is different. For the first time in 4 years of disciplinary practice, you're hesitating. Not because you doubt the spiritual necessity of what you're about to do. Your examination of conscience has revealed the usual catalog of daily failures that require penance. But because Brother Paul, the youngest member of your community, hanged himself yesterday with a rope made from his own hair shirt. The official story, the one Abbot Bernard will report to the bishop, is that Brother Paul suffered from a melancholic disposition that eventually overwhelmed his spiritual defenses. But you know the truth is more complicated. Brother Paul died because he couldn't reconcile the gap between what your disciplinary practices promised and what they actually delivered in his particular case. He disciplined himself faithfully for 2 years, following every technique Brother Augustine developed, but instead of achieving spiritual peace, he sank deeper into despair with each passing month. You remember the conversations you had with him during his final weeks, the way his eyes held a desperate quality that reminded you of a drowning man searching for something solid to grasp. Brother Thomas, he said just 5 days before his death, "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. I count my sins carefully. I measure my strikes precisely. I follow the sacred rhythm exactly as it's written. But instead of feeling closer to God, I feel more distant. Instead of finding peace, I find only more reasons to hate myself." You tried to help him, sharing your own experiences of spiritual breakthrough through disciplinary practice, reminding him that the path to holiness is never smooth or predictable. But now, staring at your scourge in the flickering candlelight, you're forced to confront a possibility that challenges everything you've believed about the relationship between pain and spiritual growth. What if these practices that have been so transformative for you are actually destructive for others? Brother Paul wasn't weak or uncommitted. He was intelligent, devout, willing to endure tremendous physical discomfort in pursuit of holiness. His flagellation sessions were often more intense than your own. His dedication to the systematic examination of conscience unquestionable. If the logic of redemptive suffering were as universal as you believed, he should have achieved the same spiritual benefits that you and most of your brother monks have experienced. Instead, he drove himself to suicide. The implications are deeply disturbing. If disciplinary practices that produce mystical experiences for Brother Marcus, profound peace for Brother Francis, and genuine spiritual transformation for yourself can simultaneously destroy someone like Brother Paul, then maybe these techniques aren't the universal pathway to holiness you've assumed them to be. Maybe they're more like medicine, beneficial for some conditions, harmful for others, requiring careful diagnosis and individual adjustment. You begin your discipline session anyway, but with a new awareness of its potential dangers. Each strike carries not just the familiar burn of leather against flesh, but also the weight of questions you've never allowed yourself to ask. Are you practicing spiritual discipline or spiritual addiction? Is the peace you feel after flagellation sessions genuine communion with the divine, or just the biochemical aftermath of deliberately induced trauma? Are the mystical experiences your community members report real encounters with God, or psychological phenomena that could be produced through other, less destructive methods? The doubt feels like a form of heresy, a betrayal of everything your monastic community represents. But Brother Paul's death has opened a crack in the wall of certainty that has protected your spiritual life for the past 4 years. And now unwelcome possibilities are seeping through that crack like cold air through a broken window. As you continue counting strikes, 15, 25, 37, you find yourself thinking about the letter from Cardinal Beaumont, the investigation your community is facing, the growing resistance within church hierarchy to the more extreme forms of monastic discipline. What if the church authorities aren't motivated primarily by political considerations? What if they've seen cases like Brother Paul's in other monasteries? Young men destroyed rather than sanctified by practices that seem to offer the promise of holiness? You finish your count at 42 strikes and set down your scourge. But the usual sense of spiritual completion doesn't follow. Instead, you feel hollow, uncertain, as if you've just completed a ritual whose meaning has suddenly become opaque. You kneel beside your cot and try to pray, but the words feel mechanical, emptied of the conviction that has always made them powerful. Over the following days, you watch your fellow brothers more carefully, looking for signs of the spiritual distress that overwhelmed Brother Paul. What you see is troubling. Brother Marcus, whose flagellation sessions often induce visionary experiences, has become increasingly isolated from normal human interaction, speaking only during required community activities and spending his free time in solitary practices that seem more compulsive than devotional. Brother Francis, who claims his disciplines have eliminated lustful thoughts, shows signs of profound depression, moving through daily routines with mechanical precision, but no apparent joy or spontaneity. Even Brother Matthias, the infirmarian whose medical knowledge has always provided reassurance about the safety of your practices, seems to be questioning assumptions he's held for decades. When you visit him for routine wound care, you notice him studying your scars with an expression that's more troubled than professional. Brother Thomas, he says quietly as he applies fresh herbs to your latest injuries, I've been thinking about Brother Paul's death, trying to understand what went wrong. I keep coming back to something that disturbs me. Maybe we've been so focused on the spiritual benefits of disciplinary practices that we've ignored their psychological costs. This admission from Brother Matthias shakes you more than anything else, because he's always been the community's most articulate defender of flagellation as both spiritually beneficial and medically sound. If he's beginning to doubt the wisdom of practices he supported for over 20 years, then maybe the questions you've been asking yourself aren't heretical after all. Maybe they're overdue. What do you mean? You ask, though you suspect you already know. I mean that pain changes the mind in ways we don't fully understand, he says slowly. We've been treating it as if it only affects the soul, as if consciousness were separate from the body's physical responses. But what if the spiritual experiences we attribute to proper flagellation are actually neurological responses to repeated trauma? What if we've been inducing brain states that feel profound, but are actually forms of damage? The possibility hangs in the air between you like an accusation. If Brother Matthias is right, then everything your community has accomplished over the centuries might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how human consciousness works. The mystical experiences, the profound peace, the sense of communion with the divine, all of it might be nothing more than the predictable result of systematically damaging your own nervous system. But even as you consider this possibility, another part of your mind rebels against it. The transformation you've experienced through disciplinary practices feels real, substantial, lasting. The reduction in pride, the increased capacity for compassion, the growing sense of connection to something larger than yourself. These changes seem too significant to dismiss as mere neurological artifacts. That night, you kneel in your cell with your scourge, as always, but you can't bring yourself to begin the familiar ritual. Instead, you sit in silence, trying to distinguish between genuine spiritual insight and the elaborate self-deception that might have been masquerading as holiness. The candlelight flickers against the stone walls, and in the dancing shadows you seem to see the ghost of Brother Paul, forever young, forever desperate, forever searching for a peace that pain could never provide. The anatomy of enlightenment. You're standing in the monastery's herb garden at dawn on the feast of St. John the Baptist, 6 months after Brother Paul's death, watching Brother Matthias harvest the plants he uses to treat flagellation wounds. The summer air is thick with the scent of lavender, rosemary, and the dozen other healing herbs that have become as essential to your community's survival as bread and water. But today you're not here to help with the harvest. You're here because Brother Matthias has promised to share with you the results of his private investigation into the physiological effects of long-term flagellation practice. I've been corresponding with physicians in Paris and Montpellier, he says quietly, his hands never pausing in their careful selection of the most potent leaves and flowers, asking questions about the relationship between deliberate pain and states of consciousness, sharing observations from my 23 years of treating disciplinary injuries. What I've learned challenges everything we thought we knew about what we're doing to ourselves. He leads you to a stone bench at the center of the garden, surrounded by the plants that have healed thousands of self-inflicted wounds over the centuries. From a leather satchel, he produces a collection of letters and manuscripts, correspondence with some of the most learned medical men in Europe, men who have studied the human body with the same systematic attention Brother Augustine devoted to the science of sacred suffering. The first thing you need to understand, Brother Matthias begins, is that the human body produces its own medicines in response to injury. When flesh is damaged, whether through accident or deliberate action, the blood releases substances that reduce pain and induce feelings of well-being. The physicians call these natural spirits, invisible essences that can dramatically alter consciousness and emotion. He shows you a letter from Master William of Salerno, who has been studying soldiers wounded in recent campaigns against the Moors. Master William reports that men with severe battle injuries often experience visions, prophetic dreams, and states of mystical ecstasy that seem identical to those described by religious contemplatives. More significantly, these altered states of consciousness become more pronounced and predictable in soldiers who suffer repeated injuries over extended periods. The implications are profound, Brother Matthias continues. The spiritual experiences we've attributed to divine grace might actually be physiological responses to trauma, natural processes that evolved to help injured animals survive by reducing their perception of pain and fear. You study the letter, trying to reconcile Master William's medical observations with your own experience of transcendent states achieved through disciplinary practice. The clinical language feels cold, reductive, yet the phenomena he describes match perfectly with what you've experienced in your own cell. The gradual dissolution of ordinary consciousness, the sense of connection to something infinitely larger than yourself, the profound peace that follows proper flagellation. But, Brother Matthias, you say carefully, even if our experiences have physiological explanations, does that make them less real? Does understanding the mechanism diminish the spiritual value of what we achieve? His expression grows troubled, and for a long moment he doesn't respond. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of someone wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. That's what I've been trying to determine, Brother Thomas. I've documented the effects of our practices on 37 different monks over more than 2 decades. The patterns are consistent. Men who practice regular flagellation show measurable changes in temperament, increased capacity for what we call spiritual virtues, genuine transformation of character. These aren't imaginary benefits. They're real improvements in human behavior and emotional stability. He pulls out another document, this one covered with detailed charts and anatomical drawings. But I've also documented the costs. Long-term practitioners show signs of what the physicians call melancholic disposition, periods of profound sadness that seem to intensify rather than diminish over time. We lose approximately 1 monk per decade to what appears to be despair-induced self-destruction. Brother Paul wasn't an isolated case. The numbers are sobering. During your 4 years in the monastery, you focused primarily on the dramatic spiritual successes. Brothers who achieved mystical experiences, overcame particular sins, developed extraordinary capacities for prayer and contemplation. But Brother Matthias's records reveal a different pattern when viewed over longer time frames. For every monk who achieves lasting spiritual transformation through disciplinary practices, another suffers psychological damage that ultimately proves destructive. The human body, Brother Matthias explains, seems to develop tolerance to pain over time, requiring increasingly severe trauma to produce the same spiritual effects. This creates a cycle of escalation that some practitioners never escape. They begin with moderate disciplines that produce genuine benefits, but gradually progress to levels of self-injury that serve no spiritual purpose. They're simply feeding an addiction to the body's own pain-reducing spirits. He shows you Brother Augustine's private journals, documents he's never shared with the community before. The man whose scientific approach to flagellation has guided. Your own practice was apparently struggling with exactly this problem during his final years. His disciplinary sessions became so severe that Brother Matthias had to intervene repeatedly to prevent permanent injury. The mystical experiences that Brother Augustine reported in his official writings were accompanied by periods of depression, so intense that he sometimes couldn't leave his cell for days at a time. Brother Augustine died believing he was a spiritual failure, Brother Matthias says quietly. Despite decades of rigorous practice, despite achievements that we've all tried to emulate, he felt that he never reached the level of holiness his disciplines should have produced. The possibility that his practices were actually preventing the spiritual growth he sought never occurred to him. This revelation forces you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about your own spiritual development. The progress you've attributed to systematic flagellation might actually be the result of other factors entirely. The community's emphasis on careful self-examination, the regular rhythm of prayer and contemplation, the support of brothers who share your commitment to spiritual growth. The pain itself might be irrelevant or even counterproductive, a dramatic but ultimately meaningless addition to practices that would be equally effective without the element of self-injury. As if reading your thoughts, Brother Matthias continues, I've been comparing our community with other monasteries that follow the rule of Saint Benedict, but don't practice flagellation. Their monks report the same kinds of spiritual growth we see here: increased humility, reduced pride, deeper prayer life, greater compassion for others. The difference is that they achieve these results without the psychological costs we've been accepting as necessary. The sun has risen higher now, warming the garden and releasing stronger fragrances from the healing herbs surrounding your bench. You sit in silence for several minutes, trying to absorb the implications of what Brother Matthias has shared. The practices that have defined your spiritual life for the past 4 years might be, at best, unnecessary additions to genuinely valuable spiritual disciplines. At worst, they might be obstacles to the very growth they purport to encourage. What do we do with this knowledge? You finally ask. Brother Matthias carefully returns the letters and manuscripts to his satchel, but his expression remains thoughtful. I don't know, Brother Thomas. The investigation from Cardinal Beaumont is still pending. Our community's future depends partly on our ability to demonstrate that our practices produce genuine spiritual benefits. If I share what I've learned with Abbot Bernard, we might be forced to abandon disciplines that, despite their costs, have genuinely helped many of our brothers. If I don't share it, we might continue practices that could destroy future members like Brother Paul. He stands and begins walking back toward the monastery, but pauses at the garden gate to look back at you. Perhaps the real question isn't whether our practices are spiritually beneficial, but whether the benefits they produce are worth the risks they create. And that's a question each monk will have to answer for himself. As you watch him disappear into the stone corridors that have become your world, you realize that your own spiritual journey has reached a crossroads you never anticipated. The practices that brought you to this point of development may no longer be appropriate for the next phase of your growth. The disciplines that carried you from comfortable young nobleman to serious religious seeker might actually prevent you from becoming the person God intends you to be. Tonight you'll kneel in your cell as always, but with a different purpose than you've had for the past 4 years. Instead of reaching for your scourge, you'll try a different kind of discipline. The courage to sit with uncertainty, to embrace questions that challenge your deepest assumptions, to find God not through the familiar pathway of pain, but through the more demanding route of intellectual honesty and spiritual maturity. Closing reflection. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey into the complex world of medieval monastic discipline, that strange intersection where profound spirituality met systematic self-destruction, where the pursuit of holiness led men to practices that seemed to us both inspiring and deeply troubling. You followed Brother Thomas through 4 years of spiritual development based on the systematic infliction of pain, watched him evolve from a comfortable young nobleman into someone willing to bleed for his beliefs, only to discover that the very practices that transformed him might also destroy him. This is the paradox that haunts all extreme spiritual practices. The line between genuine discipline and destructive obsession is thinner than those who cross it usually realize. The medieval monks who practiced flagellation weren't sadistic or mentally ill. They were intelligent, educated men following the most rigorous spiritual logic their culture could provide. They developed sophisticated techniques, documented their results with scientific precision, created communities of support for practices that must have seemed as necessary to them as prayer itself. Yet their story also reveals the dangers of any system that promises transcendence through the systematic rejection of human comfort and well-being. When spiritual practices require the practitioner to inflict genuine harm on himself, when growth is measured by the willingness to endure increasing levels of damage, the boundary between spiritual discipline and psychological self-destruction becomes impossibly difficult to maintain. The monks of St. Denis were products of a culture that understood suffering differently than we do, that saw pain as potentially redemptive rather than simply destructive. Their practices emerged from centuries of Christian tradition, supported by theological arguments that made perfect sense within their worldview. But their story also demonstrates how even the most sincere spiritual seeking can become corrupted when it loses sight of the fundamental principle that authentic holiness enhances rather than destroys human flourishing. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of their story is how closely their experience mirrors patterns we see in other contexts where devotion becomes destructive, whether in religious extremism, political fanaticism, or the countless other ways human beings convince themselves that suffering is the price of meaning. That destruction is the pathway to transcendence. Brother Thomas's journey doesn't end with clear answers or simple resolutions. Like all serious spiritual seeking, it leads him deeper into questions rather than away from them, forces him to examine assumptions he thought were beyond questioning, challenges him to find God, not through familiar formulas, but through the more demanding work of continued growth and discovery. The medieval world that produced these practices is gone, but the human impulses that drove them remain as powerful today as they were 8 centuries ago. The search for meaning that transcends ordinary experience, the desire to prove devotion through sacrifice, the belief that comfort and spiritual growth are incompatible, the conviction that genuine transformation requires the systematic rejection of natural human needs and desires. Their story reminds us that the most dangerous spiritual practices are often those that seem to work, that produce genuine experiences of transcendence and transformation, but at costs that only become apparent over time. The path to authentic holiness may require discipline and sacrifice, but it should never require the practitioner to become less human in pursuit of becoming more holy. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you not the specific practices of medieval flagellants, but the deeper questions their story raises about the nature of spiritual growth, the relationship between suffering and wisdom, the delicate balance between discipline and destruction that anyone serious about inner development must learn to navigate. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most profound spiritual practices are often the simplest ones, the disciplines that make us more rather than less capable of love, compassion, and genuine service to others. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is treat ourselves and others with the kind of tenderness that makes space for real transformation to occur naturally, without force, without violence, in its own time, and according to its own mysterious logic.